You are a money magnet. Activate the abundance you were born for. Written and published by Mindlixer. Somewhere tonight, before you opened this, there was a small moment you probably do not remember choosing. The phone was in your hand. The banking app was one tap away. And there was a pause before the tap, so brief it barely registered as a pause at all, but it was there. A held breath, a bracing. The body preparing itself for a number before the eyes had even seen it. This is where we begin, because this is where it actually lives. Not in a theory, not in a concept you can argue with in your head. In the hand, in the held breath, in the particular stillness that follows when the number on the screen is exactly what you expected it to be. Not devastation. You have learned, by now, that devastation is loud, and this is not loud. This is quieter than devastation. This is the face doing nothing. This is the practiced casualness of closing the app, even when no one is watching, as though someone might be. As though the body itself does not fully trust that it is alone with this. You know this moment. You have lived inside it more times than you could count. And the strange thing, the thing almost no one says out loud, is that your body knew the number before your eyes confirmed it. There was no shock. There was only a kind of agreement between what you suspected and what turned out to be true. A quiet handshake with disappointment made so many times that it no longer even introduces itself. It just arrives, sits down, and waits for you to notice it is there. And here is the part that almost nobody talks about, the part that lives underneath the part everyone is willing to discuss. It does not stay in the account. It gets into the room. It is there in the half-second before you have to name your price out loud to another human being. It is there in the breath you take before you send an invoice. The breath that somehow always seems to come with 3 extra words of apology attached to it. Words you did not plan to say and said anyway. It is there in the tightening in your shoulders right before a negotiation. The tightening that the other person across the table can absolutely feel. Even if they could not name it. Even if they would call it something else, like hesitation or nerves, or simply not being quite ready yet. This is the part that the scarcity does, that almost no one names plainly. It does not just limit what you have. It limits what you can become in the very moments when you most need to become something larger than your fear. The awareness of not having enough does not arrive quietly in the background of an ordinary Tuesday. It arrives loudest exactly when you need confidence the most, right before the pitch, right before the ask, right before the moment when the version of you that knows your own worth was supposed to step forward and speak. So let us be honest about what this is, before we go any further, because the honesty is the only thing strong enough to hold what comes next. This is not a financial problem dressed up as a feeling. It might be the other way around. It might be a feeling, an old one, dressed up convincingly as a financial problem. There is a tradition, far older than the modern language of vision boards and affirmations, that has a different name for what is happening here. Carl Jung spent much of his working life studying what he called the shadow, the parts of the self that get pushed out of conscious awareness before we are old enough to have any say in the matter, parts that do not disappear simply because we stop looking at them, parts that instead continue operating from underneath, shaping behavior in ways the conscious mind cannot see and therefore cannot correct. Lynn Twist, writing decades later about money specifically, in her work on what she called the soul of money, made an argument that sits very close to this same idea. That our relationship with money is rarely about money at all. It is about identity, about scarcity, as something we absorbed long before we had words for it, something that operates less like a belief we hold and more like a self we have been quietly living inside without ever choosing the architecture. This is the first thing this audio wants to name plainly, because almost nothing written about abundance is willing to say it this directly. The inability to receive money easily, to ask for what you are worth without flinching, to hold on to prosperity without some part of you working quietly to give it back, is almost never primarily a practical problem. It is rarely about not knowing the right strategy or not trying hard enough. It is far more often about an identity that was formed before you had any choice in who you would be in relationship to resources. A self that was built in rooms you do not fully remember, by people who were themselves often doing their very best, and which has been running quietly in the background of your adult life ever since, making decisions on your behalf that you would not consciously make if you were asked outright. There is a name for this, and you will hear it again and again across the time we spend together tonight, because it is the foundation everything else rests on. We will call it the scarcity identity. Not a mindset, not a belief. A pre-verbal architecture of self, built during the years when you were watching and listening and absorbing long before your conscious mind was online to filter or question any of it. And here, before we go any further into what that means, is the thing this audio wants you to feel permission for, right at the start, because you will need it for everything that follows. You are not broken. You are not bad at manifestation. You have not failed some invisible spiritual test that other people, somehow, more naturally pass. You are not vibrating at the wrong frequency in some moral sense, as though prosperity were a reward for good behavior and its absence a verdict on your character. You are carrying a frequency, one you did not choose, one that was handed to you, often lovingly, by people who were carrying it themselves without ever knowing they were passing it forward. And that distinction changes everything about what comes next, because what this audio is built to do is not to give you one more technique to layer on top of everything you have already tried. It is something older and slower and, in the end, far more permanent than a technique. It is the ability to finally see exactly where this architecture was built, because you cannot change what you cannot see, and you have been trying to change it in the dark. Let us sit for a moment with what it actually costs to live this way without ever naming it, because the cost is not what most people assume. The cost is not continued poverty, dramatic and visible and easy to point to. The cost is quieter than that, and in some ways crueler, because it hides in plain sight behind a life that looks, from the outside, like it is mostly working. This is the cost of living one full layer below what is actually available to you, not destitution. Proximity. You can see abundance. You can watch other people move through a financial reality that looks, from where you stand, almost like a parallel world, one you can observe clearly but never quite step into, no matter how many times you reach toward it. You get close. You earn enough to get by, sometimes more than enough. And then, with a kind of quiet, almost mechanical reliability, something contracts right at the threshold. The negotiation that should have gone your way goes sideways instead, for reasons you cannot quite trace. The opportunity that seemed inevitable simply does not materialize. The raise arrives eventually, 6 months later than it should have, smaller than it needed to be, and you find yourself thanking someone for giving you less than what you had already earned. There is a name for this threshold too. We will call it the abundance threshold, and it is important to understand right away that it is not a ceiling imposed by the outside world. It is not that opportunity stops existing past a certain point. It is that something inside gives itself permission to go only so far, and not one step further, regardless of what the outside world is actually offering. And here is the line worth sitting with for a moment, because it carries the entire shape of what this audio is circling. The tragedy is not the scarcity itself. The tragedy is the competence that never quite translates into what it should be worth. You are, very likely, good at what you do. You have likely worked hard, learned skills, shown up consistently, done the things that are supposed to be rewarded. And still, somehow, the reward arrives diminished or delayed, or both. This is not a coincidence, and it is not bad luck repeating itself with suspicious regularity. It is a pattern, and patterns, unlike chaos, can eventually be understood. Before we go further into understanding it, there is something small worth noticing now, almost in passing, something that will not be fully explained yet but deserves to be planted here so that later, when its full shape becomes visible, you will recognize it rather than meeting it as something new. Most families carry an unspoken financial ceiling. No one in the family ever sat down and consciously decided on it. No one announced it at a dinner table. And yet it exists, almost like a kind of gravity specific to that particular household. And children absorb it, not through what they are told about money in words, but through what they watch happening in the bodies of the adults around them. Most of us inherited not just our parents' financial circumstances, but something closer to their financial nervous system. Their particular way of going still when an unexpected bill arrived in the mail. The exact tone in their voice, the one you could recognize instantly even now, decades later, when they had to say the words, "We cannot afford that." You did not learn this information. You absorbed it, the way a younger sibling absorbs an older one's posture without ever deciding to copy it. We will return to this fully later. For now, simply notice that it has been said, and let it sit quietly in the back of your awareness, the way a name you have heard once tends to surface again later with a small shock of recognition. What this audio is building toward is not a new belief for you to adopt and repeat to yourself in the mirror each morning. It is something sturdier than that, and in some ways more demanding, because beliefs can be discarded the moment life gets difficult again, while a new way of seeing, once it is genuinely available to you, cannot be made unavailable. Once you can see the architecture clearly, you cannot fully unsee it. That is the actual promise here. Not motivation. Not a temporary lift. A permanent change in what you are capable of noticing about your own behavior. And to get there is something that has to be named first, something that most of what has been written about money, in all its abundance language and law of attraction promises, carefully avoids ever saying directly. So let us name it. The scarcity identity is not the same thing as a scarcity mindset, and the difference between those two phrases matters more than it might first appear. A mindset is conscious. It is accessible. It can, at least in theory, be updated the moment new information arrives. The way Carol Dweck's well-known research on mindset describes a person shifting their beliefs about their own capacity to grow and improve. A mindset lives at the level of thought, and thought, however stubborn, can be argued with. An identity is different. An identity is pre-conscious. It does not sit at the level of thought at all. It sits underneath thought, in the place where thought gets generated in the first place. You do not walk around consciously, thinking the sentence, "I am someone who does not have money." You simply are that someone, quietly, invisibly, in 1,000 small decisions a day that never rise to the level of conscious deliberation until the moment the identity itself is finally made visible to you. This is precisely why the techniques have not worked. Not because you did the affirmations wrong, not because your visualizations were not vivid enough, not because you failed some test of belief. Affirmations, visualizations, gratitude practices, all of these operate at the level of conscious thought. They are trying to redecorate a room whose architecture you have never had access to. You can repaint the walls of a house as many times as you like. If the foundation was poured a certain way before you were born, the paint will not change what the house actually is. Here is an image that may help the idea settle somewhere more permanent than language. Picture a radio. Not a broken radio, because that is not what we are describing here. A perfectly functioning radio, calibrated long ago to a specific station. A station it was tuned to before you had the hands or the understanding to turn the dial yourself. The radio works exactly as designed. It receives precisely what it was calibrated to receive. The question has never really been whether the radio was broken. The question is what station it was set to all those years ago, and whether that particular station is still actually playing anything you need to hear now. Most abundance teaching tells you to simply want a different station, as though wanting were sufficient. Some go a step further and tell you to believe in a different station, as though belief alone could reach all the way down to where the dial actually sits. A smaller number tell you to visualize the different station vividly enough that the universe, in whatever sense you understand that word, will somehow respond and shift things on your behalf. But almost none of them hand you the dial itself. The scarcity identity is the dial. It was turned to a particular setting by someone else at a time when you did not yet have hands of your own. Where does this dial actually get set? This is worth understanding slowly and completely, because the mechanism matters more than the metaphor. It forms somewhere between birth and roughly 7 years of age, and it forms not through anything anyone explicitly taught you about money, but through what you observed in the behavior of the adults around you. A child watching a parent's face tighten almost imperceptibly while standing at a grocery store checkout is not learning the cognitive fact that the family does not have enough money. That fact may never even be stated in words the child could understand. What the child is learning, instead, is something far more fundamental and far harder to later locate and examine. The child is learning what kind of creature they are in a world that contains resources and the management of resources. The lesson is somatic. It lives in the body, not in any conceptual understanding that could be reasoned with later. By the time that child becomes an adult, this early wiring shows up as a recognizable set of behaviors, a kind of grammar that repeats itself with remarkable consistency across very different lives and very different circumstances. Undercharging for the value of work actually delivered. Apologizing, almost reflexively, the instant a price is stated out loud. Genuine difficulty receiving a gift without immediately minimizing it, deflecting the compliment embedded inside it, insisting it was not necessary. A near compulsion to explain financial decisions in detail to people who never actually asked for an explanation. And, perhaps strangest of all to anyone observing from the outside, a wave of something close to guilt that arrives not when money is lost, but precisely when it unexpectedly arrives. These are not personality quirks, scattered and unrelated. They are the behavioral signature of a specific scarcity identity, operating exactly as it was designed to operate, generation after generation, situation after situation, with a consistency that would be almost admirable if it were not so costly. And here is the deepest part of the mechanism, the part that explains something that confuses almost everyone who tries to work on this, using only conscious willpower. Why does the scarcity identity survive even after the actual material scarcity that originally produced it has long since ended? Why does someone who is now, by any objective measure, financially secure, still feel the same old contraction the moment money arrives in unusually generous amounts? The answer is this. The scarcity identity was never really about the scarcity itself. It was about belonging. A family's particular relationship to money, however painful, was also, quietly, a membership card. It was a shared language, a shared way of moving through the world that connected every person inside that family to one another, even when, especially when, nothing else connected them. To receive abundantly now, to charge confidently what you know your work is worth, to hold money without instinctively apologizing for having it, can feel, somewhere far below the level of conscious thought, like a kind of betrayal of the very people who raised you. Not a belief you hold. A loyalty response wired into the body the same way a flinch is wired into the body, occurring before any conscious decision has had time to weigh in. If this is true, and there is real reason to believe it is, then the entire project changes shape. Financial transformation, at this depth, is not primarily a financial project at all. It is, more honestly, a grief project. At some point along this path, choosing a genuinely different relationship with money requires becoming, at the level of the nervous system, someone slightly less recognizable to the very people who formed you in the first place. This does not mean leaving them. It does not require anger, rejection, or some dramatic break with your own history. It means something quieter and, in its own way, harder. It means being willing to move to a different floor of the same building you both still live in, and being willing to notice, without panic, the guilt that arrives the first few times you do. Your nervous system might be protecting your money problem precisely because your money problem has become one of the last remaining threads connecting you to where you came from. That sentence deserves to sit with you for a moment before we move forward, because it is not meant to comfort you in any easy way. It is meant to clarify something that has likely felt, until now, simply chaotic and unfair. Which raises a question that almost no abundance teaching ever actually arrives at, because it is far less marketable than the question they usually ask instead. The usual question is, how do you attract more? The deeper question, the one that actually leads somewhere real, is this: who do you have to be willing to become in order to let more stay? Those are not the same question, and only one of them changes anything. Now, here is where most work on this subject quietly stops, satisfied that childhood conditioning explains everything. And for some people, genuinely, it does. Some people work through their early history, repair what needs repairing in their relationship with their family of origin, and find that their financial life follows along behind that healing with a kind of natural, almost obedient consistency. But for many people, perhaps including you, listening to this right now, it does not. You may have already done real work on your own history. You may have done years of therapy, genuinely transformed your relationship with your parents, made peace with where you came from, and still, somehow, find the exact same financial ceiling, waiting patiently for you on the other side of all that healing, as though it had never actually left. Or perhaps the opposite pattern fits you more closely. You grew up in genuine material abundance with none of the early conditioning we just described, and yet you still find yourself, inexplicably, living inside scarcity now, as an adult, with no clear personal history that would explain why. Or perhaps you have changed everything external about your life that could possibly be changed. New city, new career, new relationships, new friendships, an entirely reconstructed daily existence. And still, somehow, the same frequency follows you into each new context, as though you packed it carefully into a suitcase without ever consciously deciding to bring it along. If the scarcity identity were only a product of your own personal history, then healing that personal history should, logically, be enough to resolve it. And it is not enough for many people. Which means there is a deeper layer underneath the personal one, a layer that does not originate with you at all. This deeper layer has a name too, drawn from the intersection of several different fields that, on the surface, rarely speak to one another. We will call it transgenerational financial transmission. And the foundation for taking it seriously comes from real and growing research into how trauma and stress responses can be transmitted across generations at a level deeper than storytelling or example, research associated with scientists like Rachel Yehuda, whose work on the biology of inherited stress responses has reshaped how seriously the scientific community now takes the idea that what our ancestors lived through can leave a measurable trace passed forward into the bodies of their descendants. It connects, too, to the tradition of family constellations work developed by Bert Hellinger, which approaches inherited family patterns not as metaphor, but as a kind of living field that continues operating across generations until it is consciously seen and addressed. The argument, stated plainly, is this: what you carry in your own financial nervous system may not have originated with you at all. It may have originated with people who lived through something genuinely severe: famine, war, economic collapse, forced displacement from everything familiar, real, material, life-threatening poverty, the kind that reshapes a person's entire relationship to safety and resources. And the survival responses those experiences produced were not only passed down through stories told at family gatherings. They were encoded. The growing body of research suggests, biologically, at the level of how genes express themselves and carried forward into the bodies of children and grandchildren who never personally lived through the original crisis at all. This single reframe changes the entire shape of the project, and it deserves to be said clearly. The scarcity identity, understood this way, is not a personal failure. And it is not simply a childhood wound that one person failed to heal thoroughly enough. It is a transmission, something handed across time, the way a physical trait might be handed across time, except this is a pattern of fear and contraction rather than a color of eyes. And transmissions, unlike personal failures, can be received consciously, understood, honored for what they cost the people who first carried them, and then, deliberately, not forwarded any further. How do you tell the difference between conditioning that originated in your own personal childhood and something older, something that arrived before you did? There are recognizable signatures, and you may notice yourself in some of them right now. A scarcity response that feels older than any personal memory you can locate, as though the fear of not having enough lives somewhere closer to your bones than to your mind. An inexplicable wave of guilt that arrives alongside genuine prosperity. Guilt that has no clear personal origin story attached to it, no specific memory you can point to and say, this is where that feeling came from. And a particular kind of financial self-sabotage that arrives not with the texture of choice, but with the strange, heavy texture of inevitability, as though some part of you always somehow knew you would end up exactly here, at this familiar limitation, no matter which path you took to get there. You are not struggling because you have not tried hard enough, or because you have not believed clearly enough, or because some cosmic ledger has marked you down as unworthy. You may be struggling because you are the particular person in your own lineage who happened to be handed this work, the one in whom the old frequency finally became conscious enough to be looked at directly, rather than simply lived out unconsciously, generation after generation, the way it had been for everyone who came before you. In the language of family constellations, this is not described as a burden. It is described as something closer to an appointment. Now return, for a moment, to the small detail planted earlier, the observation about a parent's face tightening at a grocery store checkout, about the specific tone of a voice saying, "We cannot afford that." That moment was never simply emotional observation, a child noticing an adult's feelings the way a child might notice a stranger's feelings on the street. It was something closer to biological synchronization. The child's nervous system was syncing itself to the adult's nervous system in precisely the way every young primate's nervous system syncs with the nervous systems of whoever it depends upon for survival. The child did not learn the frequency the way they learned vocabulary words. They absorbed it through direct biological attunement, before language had even fully arrived to help make sense of any of it. This is exactly why language-based techniques, affirmations, beliefs, stated intentions struggle so persistently to reach it. The wound is older than the words. That stillness you once watched, in someone you loved, standing at a checkout counter or sitting at a kitchen table with an unopened bill, was never something you merely observed from a safe distance. You borrowed it. And it is still living in your body right now, in precisely the place they left it, waiting, patiently, the way old furniture waits in a room nobody visits anymore. There is something almost tender available here, if you are willing to stay with it a little longer than feels immediately comfortable. You are not failing. You are, in a very real sense, faithful. Faithful to people you love. Faithful to a story that deserved, at some point, to be witnessed honestly rather than simply inherited silently. The question that opens now is not how to escape what they carried, as though it were something shameful to be discarded as quickly as possible. The question is how to honor what they carried without needing to go on carrying it forward yourself. Those are genuinely different things, and the difference between them is where real change actually becomes possible. Bring everything together now, gently, because this is the moment where the separate pieces finally meet. The scarcity identity, formed in early childhood through observation rather than instruction, operating ever since as a loyalty response rather than a simple fear response. The deeper layer of transgenerational transmission, a frequency handed forward biologically across generations by people who survived something real and were simply trying, in their own way, to keep the next generation safe. And underneath both of these, the simple, stubborn fact that language-based techniques fail to reach any of it because the entire structure was encoded before language ever arrived on the scene. Picture a river, not a metaphor for flow or ease or abundance arriving effortlessly. A literal river, the kind you could stand beside and watch moving. This particular river has been running along the exact same groove in the landscape for many generations now. The groove was not imposed on the river from outside. The river itself cut that groove, slowly, by following the path of least resistance available to it at the time, a path that was itself shaped by whatever came before it, by older rock, older rainfall, older weather no one alive remembers directly anymore. Now imagine standing at the very source of that river and attempting to redirect its entire course simply by telling it to want a different direction. This is, quite precisely, what affirmations have been trying to do all along. Not because affirmations are foolish, but because they are aimed at the water, when the actual determining factor has always been the geology underneath it. To genuinely redirect the river, you need to understand the geology. You need to see the underlying structure that determines, almost mechanically, where the water is able to go and where it simply cannot. That understanding is what everything we have walked through together has actually been building toward. So here, finally, is the central understanding. And it deserves to be said plainly, without ceremony, the way the truest things often arrive. You are not a money magnet waiting to be switched on by the right technique or the right amount of belief. You are a frequency, and that frequency was tuned before you were old enough to have any say in the matter. The real question, underneath every other question this work has raised, has never actually been, how do I attract abundance? The real question has always been, quietly, persistently, underneath everything else, whose relationship to money am I currently living? Because once you understand that the scarcity identity is transgenerational as well as personal, the nature of the work itself changes. It is no longer simply self-improvement, the steady accumulation of better habits and stronger beliefs. It becomes something closer to self-differentiation, the gradual, patient process of becoming distinct enough from the inherited frequency that your own actual signal finally has the room it needs to emerge. What does this look like in an ordinary life? Not as a set of instructions to follow, but as moments you may begin to recognize as they happen. The moment you state your price clearly, without the familiar rehearsed apology trailing behind it, not because the fear has disappeared, but because you have learned to let the fear simply be present without handing it the microphone. The moment a windfall arrives, unexpected and generous, and you do not immediately scramble to redistribute it into safety, to make it smaller, less visible, less like something that might draw unwanted attention. The moment your own nervous system simply allows money to stay where it has landed, not with euphoria, with something quieter and, in its own way, far more significant. The settled, unremarkable feeling of something that finally belongs exactly where it is. The frequency you were actually born for is not the one you were handed at the very beginning of your life. It is the one that has been waiting underneath the one you were handed all along, quieter, steadier, carrying no particular urgency in it at all, simply waiting for enough space to finally be heard. Return, for a moment, to wherever you began tonight, to whatever brought you here in the first place. The exhaustion of trying every method available and still finding yourself stuck in the same familiar place. You were never broken. You were attempting to shift a geological formation using nothing but a compass. The compass was never wrong, exactly. It was always pointing towards something real. The actual problem was simply the scale of the intervention being applied to it. What shifts, once this understanding genuinely lands, is not motivation in the usual sense. It is orientation. You stop asking the old, exhausted question of what should I do differently this time, and you begin asking a new question instead. What in my current financial behavior actually belongs to me? And what was I simply handed without ever being asked? That second question is the one that quietly changes everything, because once you can finally distinguish between the frequency you inherited and the frequency you actually are underneath it, the real work of living that second frequency can finally begin. You do not have to dismantle everything that came before you. You do not have to reject it, renounce it, or carry anger toward the people who passed it forward to you, almost always without any awareness that they were doing so. You only have to become willing, slowly, at whatever pace your own nervous system can genuinely hold without overwhelming itself, to let your own signal grow a little louder than theirs. What that actually looks like, not in theory, but in the specific, lived architecture of a life being rebuilt one ordinary day at a time, is what we turn toward next. There are 3 laws worth naming here, though it is more accurate to call them recognitions than laws, because you will likely find, as we walk through them, that some part of you already knew each one, simply without the language to say it clearly until now. The first recognition concerns visibility. You cannot change a frequency you cannot see, and the frequency is only ever visible in behavior, never in thought alone. Thoughts are conscious and curated and easy to dress up however we would like them to appear. Behavior is honest in a way thought rarely manages to be. The scarcity identity does not announce itself through what you consciously believe about money. It shows up, instead, in how your body reacts the moment someone asks your price. In whether you open an unexpected bill the instant it arrives or let it sit unopened on the counter for days. In whether money is a subject you can discuss easily or one that carries a particular, recognizable discomfort whenever it comes up in conversation. In whether you can genuinely celebrate someone else's financial success without a quiet undertow of comparison pulling at you underneath the celebration. The scarcity identity does not show up in the mind. It shows up in the hands. The second recognition concerns permission. Abundance does not arrive simply because you have learned to want it more clearly or to visualize it more vividly. It arrives because something inside your own system finally gives it permission to stay once it has arrived. Permission, here, is not a thought you decide to have. It is a state of the nervous system itself. The capacity to let something good remain present without immediately contracting around it, without finding some unconscious way to redistribute it, without quietly deciding it does not really count. Most people carry what we might call a receiving ceiling, a level of incoming resources beyond which the nervous system stops interpreting the abundance as gain and begins interpreting it instead as threat. The threat is rarely dramatic or obvious. It is subtle, a sense of exposure, a sense of departing from what is familiar, a sense of growing distance from the people you came from. Abundance work that ignores this ceiling entirely tends to produce the same recognizable pattern again and again. The windfall that somehow evaporates within months. The raise that gets absorbed into spending that quietly restores the original financial level. The business that grows reliably to a certain point and then, with strange consistency, contracts back to almost exactly where it started. The specific number you keep finding yourself returning to, again and again, year after year, is not a coincidence, and it is not bad luck repeating itself. It is a setting. And settings, unlike fate, can be changed. But only once they have actually been read clearly. The third recognition concerns coherence. The frequency you broadcast outward and the frequency you actually inhabit underneath it must, eventually, match one another. This is precisely where most conventional abundance work fails most completely. It teaches people to broadcast a frequency of confidence and ease through language, through visualization, through carefully stated beliefs, while leaving the frequency they actually inhabit entirely untouched underneath all of it. The body always knows which one is real, and money, like every other form of energy that moves between people, responds to the frequency you actually inhabit, not the one you are performing for an audience. This is why the person who has genuinely settled into peace with what they currently have so often finds more arriving toward them, almost effortlessly, while the person who is working hard to perform abundance outwardly tends to remain at the same level, regardless of how many techniques they apply. You attract what you actually are, not what you declare yourself to be. And what you are is written into the body, not into the mouth. Step back now, for a moment, from the vast scale of transgenerational transmission, from frequencies and laws and inherited architecture, down into something far smaller and more ordinary. Picture the end of an average workday. Picture looking at what you produced that day and quietly considering, just to yourself, what it is actually worth. Not the market rate someone else assigned to it. Not the number you will eventually feel comfortable charging out loud. The number that lives in your own private accounting, the one you have never once said to another person. For most people still living inside a scarcity identity, there is a gap between that private number and the public one they actually charge. The private number is almost always higher. Always. And it has likely never once been spoken aloud to anyone, including yourself. This gap is not a belief waiting to be corrected through better thinking. It is a wound waiting to be witnessed honestly. The actual work does not live in the affirmations, or in the visualizations, or in any of the techniques you have already tried and found yourself returning to this, still stuck, still wondering why none of it seemed to land. The work lives in the quiet, private conversation between what you already know, somewhere inside yourself, that you are worth, and what you have so far been willing to actually ask for out loud. Closing that particular gap is not a technique you can apply once and be finished with. It is a practice, returned to again and again. And it begins, simply, with being honest about how wide the gap actually is. Return, finally, to the pattern named earlier, the listener who succeeds almost, who gets consistently close to something larger and then, just as consistently, contracts back to safety at the very last moment. From everything we have walked through together, that pattern is no longer legible as failure at all. It is legible, instead, as precision. The scarcity identity operating exactly as it was originally calibrated to operate, finding the precise edge of what the system currently has permission to hold, and pulling back from that edge every single time with remarkable, almost admirable consistency. This reframe is not meant to comfort you in any easy or immediate way. It is meant to clarify something that has likely felt, until now, simply chaotic, simply unfair, simply bad luck arriving over and over again in slightly different disguises. The ceiling has a precise location. The contraction has a specific, traceable trigger. The withdrawal has a recognizable shape, repeating itself with a consistency that chaos, by definition, never actually has. And patterns, unlike chaos, can eventually be worked with. You were not failing. You were following a very old instruction set with what amounts to perfect fidelity, exactly as it was designed to be followed. The only real question left now is whether you are still willing to keep following it, now that you can finally see it clearly for what it actually is. Something in you already knew most of what has been said tonight. Not consciously, not in a way you could have explained to anyone before now. You knew it in the body that tightened, just slightly, before you opened the banking app. You knew it in the voice that softened, almost involuntarily, the moment you had to name your own price out loud. You have been living this knowledge all along, carrying it quietly through years of ordinary days. What has been added tonight, and it is a small addition carrying a surprisingly large implication, is simply the language for it. Whether the actual change, from here forward, happens through conscious daily practice, through somatic work that reaches the body directly, through deliberate ancestral healing, or simply through the slow, quiet accumulation of years in which you chose, moment by moment, again and again, to let your own frequency grow a little louder than the one you were originally handed. This audio cannot tell you which path is yours. Not because the question has no answer, because the answer is, in the end, entirely individual, shaped by your own particular history and your own particular body and your own particular pace. What this audio has not been able to touch, because it cannot be fully touched in a single sitting, however long, is the actual, ongoing practice of differentiation. The specific, slow, day-by-day work of quietly becoming who you were before the inherited frequency ever arrived. That question, whenever you find yourself ready for it, opens into something far larger than a single night's listening could ever contain. It asks for your life, not your attention for one evening. The frequency you were born for has been waiting. It was never gone. Before you go, one simple question remains, easy enough to answer honestly. Did tonight feel like new information arriving for the first time? Or did it feel more like remembering something you had always, somewhere, already known? There is no right answer to this question, but the difference between those two feelings is worth knowing about yourself, quietly, as you carry whatever came up tonight back into the rest of your life.